Imagine a typical night in medieval London or Paris. The streets are plunged into total darkness, and the silence is broken only by the wind. Suddenly, someone screams desperately for help, and the sky is lit up by an eerie orange glow. This meant only one thing: a fire had broken out somewhere, and every minute counted. No one dialed the emergency number because people had to save themselves. In those days, fires could destroy entire cities in just a few hours. The wooden houses stood so close together that the flames leaped from roof to roof in an instant. It is hard for modern people to grasp the scale of this constant, daily threat. Today we are used to smoke detectors and wailing sirens outside our windows. Back then, the only warning signs were a neighbor's shout and the ringing of a church bell. But this is where things get most interesting and unexpected for us. We're used to thinking that people in the past simply ran around in a panic with buckets. In reality, they had a complex and brutal survival system. Medieval communities fought fires using methods that would seem barbaric to modern firefighters. And yet these harsh rules actually worked and saved thousands of lives. They had no pumps, hydrants, or rescue helicopters. Their arsenal consisted only of well water, hooks, and their own hands. If a house caught fire, there was practically no chance of saving it. It sounds cruel, but medieval firefighters didn't put out the burning building. They put out the neighboring structures. The goal was to stop the chain reaction at any cost, even if it meant destroying someone else's property. Modern experts call this creating fire breaks. Medieval people simply called it common sense and their only chance of survival. They developed clear protocols for action hundreds of years before the advent of fire departments. These rules were written in blood, ash, and cities burned to the ground. Your life literally depended on how quickly your neighbors would come to your aid. Try to grasp one simple thing about life in a medieval city. Fire was everywhere. In stoves, in candles, in blacksmiths' forges, and in bakers' ovens. People literally lived inside a giant powder keg, playing with sparks. Any overturned lamp or carelessly tossed coal could wipe the city off the face of the earth. That's why the fear of fire united people more strongly than the threat of war or the plague. We'll talk about how ordinary townspeople transformed into a well-coordinated army. You'll learn why wooden hooks were valued more than barrels of water. We'll examine why people were forced to go out into the streets at night and stand watch for hours on end. Today, we view fire safety as something boring, written in fine print. Back then, it was a matter of life and death that affected absolutely every resident. Modern technology has made us complacent and caused us to forget our basic instincts. Your smart home will call the emergency services on its own if it detects smoke in the kitchen. A medieval peasant would simply laugh at the helplessness of modern people. They relied solely on the strength of their own hands and the mutual aid of the entire town community. And to be honest, their organization in moments of chaos commands immense respect. Let's travel back to an era when every evening could be your last. We'll walk through narrow streets where thatched roofs almost touch one another. You'll feel that very same gnawing fear that kept people awake at night. This is not a story of destruction, but of astonishing human resilience and ingenuity. Get ready to be amazed by how our ancestors solved unsolvable problems with their bare hands. We're about to dive into a world of ashes, hooks, and leather buckets. Forget all those Hollywood movies where heroes leap gracefully through the flames. Reality was much grittier, harsher, and demanded incredible physical strength. But it was from this chaos that the principles of rescue we use today were born. So let's find out what happened when a house caught fire without firefighters or water. A medieval town was essentially a trap made of wood and straw. Houses were built from the cheapest and most readily available materials of the time. Stone was incredibly expensive, so it was used only for churches and castles. Ordinary people lived in frame houses filled with clay and dry branches. This structure dried out in the sun and turned into perfect kindling. Narrow streets made the situation even more dangerous and unpredictable. In some cities, the upper floors of houses overhung the street, forming a tunnel. Neighbors could literally pass salt to each other through a window on the other side of the street. When one house caught fire, the flames instantly spread to the opposite side. This created a wind tunnel effect that fanned the flames even more. Now we use fire-resistant materials and build wide avenues. Medieval city planners didn't think about such things because they were saving space. Cities were surrounded by defensive walls, and the space inside was worth a fortune. So people crammed their houses right up against each other, ignoring any safety concerns. It sounds like suicide, but they simply had no other choice. Open fires were the sole source of heat and light. Women cooked meals on hearths that burned right in the center of the room. In the evenings, homes were lit by tallow candles and pine torches that constantly sparked. Add to this the fact that the floors were often covered with dry straw for warmth. All it took was a single fallen candle for the entire house to turn into a crematorium. Modern fire safety experts would be horrified. Medieval cities violated absolutely every conceivable safety rule. Blacksmiths and bakers worked with furnaces right on the ground floors of residential buildings. Sparks flew onto wooden facades hundreds of times every day. It is not surprising that cities burned, but that they stood for so long at all. A fire in Rouen in the early 13th century destroyed the city completely. London burned with frightening regularity, losing thousands of buildings in a single night. People rebuilt their homes on the ashes, using the very same materials. It seems foolish, but wood remained the only available resource for most people. They simply accepted this risk as an inevitable part of their hard lives. The climate also played its cruel part in this fiery lottery. A long, dry summer turned thatched roofs into tinder ready to explode. Strong winds could carry burning embers hundreds of meters in all directions. There are documented cases where a single barn fire destroyed an entire neighborhood. The weather dictated the situation, and people could only watch the flames helplessly. But this is where things get truly interesting and unusual. Realizing the scale of the threat, medieval authorities began introducing the first building codes. In London, following yet another fire, thatching roofs with straw was banned. Residents were required to use tiles, or at least wooden planks. However, not everyone was able to comply with these rules due to the poverty of the population. Wealthy merchants were the first to realize that brick would save their capital. They began erecting stone firewalls between their wooden warehouses. If a neighbor's house caught fire, this solid wall would stop the fire from spreading. Today we see such firewalls in every modern building, but they were invented back then specifically to save goods from the inevitable ashes. Thus, the wooden trap gradually taught people to think ahead. Fire was a harsh teacher that did not forgive negligence or laziness. Every disaster forced society to take a tiny step towards safety. They couldn't change the laws of physics, but they could change how they organized themselves. And the next step was a system that forced neighbors to watch over one another. When the sun went down, the medieval city was plunged into an atmosphere of total paranoia. Darkness brought with it the greatest fear of a sudden fire. That is precisely why many European cities introduced a law regarding the evening bell. The French called it couvre-feu, which literally translates to cover the fire. The modern English word curfew derives from this term. At the sound of this bell, all residents were required to extinguish any open flames. Special metal covers were placed over fireplaces to prevent sparks from flying. If a guard spotted a light in a window after lights out, the homeowner faced a severe fine. It sounds like a dictatorship, but it was the only way to sleep peacefully at night. No one wanted to be woken up by a neighbor's crooked splinter catching fire. But there is another fascinating detail from those times. City authorities organized special night patrols to monitor the dark streets. Ordinary citizens took turns walking with lanterns and sniffing the air. If they smelled smoke, they were required to sound the alarm immediately. Your safety literally depended on the nose of a local baker or blacksmith. This work was dirty, cold, and completely unpaid. But refusing to take a night watch was practically impossible without consequences. People today often complain about their work schedules in a cozy office. Imagine being on duty outside in the winter, searching for a source of smoke, and if you miss a spark, your own home will burn to the ground too. The watchmen carried heavy halberds and wooden rattles. Upon spotting a flame, they would make the loudest, most grating sound possible. This noise woke up the entire street more effectively than any modern alarm clock. People would jump out of bed, grab buckets, and run out into the darkness. There was absolutely no time for hesitation or morning coffee. Panic in such moments was the community's greatest enemy. That is why some cities had strict rules of conduct during an alarm. Men were required to run to the fire, while women stayed at their homes with water. This resembles modern evacuation instructions, only stricter. The Romans used similar systems, but in the Middle Ages they had to be reinvented. Interestingly, paranoia drove people to spy on their neighbors. If someone knew that a neighbor liked to drink and fall asleep by the stove, they kept an eye on him. Social pressure worked better than any official safety inspector. No one hesitated to break into someone else's home if they saw dangerous sparks coming from the chimney. Personal boundaries ended where the threat of a general fire began. Modern psychology calls this collective group responsibility. Medieval people simply called it the desire to live to see the next morning. In cramped wooden housing, your life depended directly on the competence of others, and this formed incredibly close-knit, though suspicious, communities. Today, we may go years without knowing the name of our neighbor on the same flight of stairs. But what happened when the watchman's rattle finally shattered the night's silence? A phase began that could safely be called organized and bloody chaos. No fire trucks with flashing lights or professionals in fire-resistant suits. The city had to be saved by people in nightgowns and wooden shoes, and their main weapon was a simple human chain. This system of watch duty proved its incredible effectiveness over the centuries. Constant vigilance helped reduce the number of nighttime disasters in cities. People realized that prevention is cheaper than building a new house. Modern monitoring systems use the same principle, just with electronics. A smoke detector does today what a tired neighbor with a lantern did back then.
The shadows are long tonight.
So, the bell rings, and the whole neighborhood rushes out into the narrow street. There was no time for panic or lengthy deliberation about a plan of action. Medieval townspeople followed a strict protocol for forming a rescue chain. Women, children, and the elderly immediately lined up in a row, starting from the nearest well. Men ran into the thick of the fire to pour water directly onto the flames. This was the most effective system for delivering water before the invention of pumps. Full buckets were passed from hand to hand along one side of the human chain. Empty buckets were returned to the water source along the other side. Working in such a human chain was incredibly hard and dangerous. A leather bucket filled with water weighs about 10 kilograms. Passing it 100 times in a row is a task that would make your arms fall off. Now imagine doing this next to a burning building. The heat is so intense that the hairs on your eyebrows start to curl and smell of smoke. Discipline in these lines was enforced by the harshest methods. If someone dropped a bucket or broke the rhythm, they could literally be beaten. One person's mistake meant the loss of a precious second and valuable water. No excuses were accepted because the entire city was at stake. It was a cruel but fair mechanism for the crowd's survival. And the most surprising thing is that no one tried to extinguish the burning house itself. This contradicts all our modern instincts to save property. If a building caught fire, it was considered a lost cause and left to burn out. Water was poured exclusively on neighboring houses and their thatched roofs. The goal was to prevent the fire from spreading further down the street, but there was often a catastrophic shortage of water from wells for firefighting. Wooden houses burned at such high temperatures that the water simply evaporated. And that's when the most brutal weapon of medieval firefighters came into play. When water couldn't stop the flames, destruction was the next step. And for this, they used tools that looked like instruments of torture. Imagine a huge iron hook on a long wooden pole. It looked as if it could pull a whale out of the ocean. This very tool was the main weapon of medieval firefighting teams. It was called a fire hook, and it served one very brutal purpose. They literally tore houses to pieces with it to stop the fire. When the flames threatened to spread to the next block, a radical decision was made. A neighboring house, still untouched by the fire, had to be destroyed immediately. Men threw iron hooks onto the wooden roof beams and walls. Then they attached thick ropes to them and pulled with all their might. The wooden framed building crashed to the ground with a crash, creating a buffer zone. This method sounds like pure barbarism and savagery. Demolishing an entire house just in case seems like madness. But modern experts call this creating a fire break. Without fuel, the fire cannot spread further and gradually dies out. The Romans did the same thing, and this method still works today in forest fires. The hooks themselves were incredibly heavy and required collective strength. Usually 5 to 10 strong men pulled on a single rope. They had to work in sync like river barge haulers. If the beam fell the wrong way, it could crush the rescuers themselves. This required precise calculation and a cool head in moments of panic. Every parish or district kept several such hooks in storage. They hung on the walls of churches so they could be grabbed quickly. The church was not only a spiritual center, but also a warehouse for equipment. Ropes, leather buckets, and even ladders were often stored there as well. Religion and survival went hand in those days. Some houses were dismantled so quickly that it boggles the imagination. Medieval carpenters built structures using wooden pegs without nails. If the right beams were pulled out, the house would collapse like a house of cards. It was like a giant, deadly game of Jenga, and these guys were true masters of controlled demolition. Today, firefighters use chainsaws and hydraulic cutters. They can carefully pry open a door or cut through a roof. Our ancestors didn't have that luxury or the time to spare. They relied on brute muscle power and the laws of physics. My shoulders start to ache just thinking about such hard work. The tactics for demolishing houses were brutal, but mathematically sound. Better to lose 5 buildings than to let 500 burn down. And although the hooks left ruins in their wake, they saved civilization. However, even a demolished house left smoldering debris behind. And here we return to the biggest problem, the water shortage. The main tragedy of medieval fires lay in the logistics of water. You can gather thousands of people into a human chain of buckets. You can tear down hundreds of houses with iron hooks. But if the well is empty, your city will still turn to ashes. And wells in those days dried up with frightening regularity. Before the invention of pressurized water mains, water was a heavy burden. On an ordinary day, women spent hours carrying it home. During a fire, the need for water increased 1,000-fold. City reservoirs were emptied within the first 30 minutes of intense firefighting. After that, all that remained was to hope for a miracle or heavy rain. Many cities were located on the banks of large rivers. It would seem, here it is, an endless source of free water for everyone. But try running from the city center to the river with buckets. The distance of a mile made delivering water a completely pointless endeavor. By the time a bucket reached the fire, the house had already burned to the ground. That is why wise rulers began to create artificial reserves. In some courtyards, it was mandatory to keep huge oak barrels filled with rainwater. These barrels were forbidden to be used for laundry or washing dishes. The water in them grew moldy, went bad, and smelt simply disgusting. But for extinguishing a fire, the quality of the liquid did not matter at all. Interestingly, the dirt in such water sometimes even helped the cause. The murky, clay-filled sludge better enveloped the burning surfaces. It created a crust that blocked oxygen from reaching the wood. Modern firefighters use special foam for the very same purposes. Medieval people achieved this effect by accident, using stagnant swamp water. Another surprising solution was the use of beer supplies. It sounds like a joke, but beer saved quite a few buildings in Europe. There were many breweries, and they stored huge vats of the liquid. When the wells ran dry, the foamy treasure of local taverns came into play. And the most interesting thing is that beer extinguishes fire slightly more effectively than ordinary water. By the 15th century, engineers had begun to think about pumps. The first primitive hand pumps with wooden wheels appeared. They looked like giant syringes that were operated by several people at once. The pressure was weak and the jet only reached a few meters, but this was the first step toward the mechanization of rescue operations. These machines were called water syringes, and they were incredibly expensive. Only the wealthiest guilds or city councils could afford them. The mechanisms often broke down right in the middle of fighting the flames. Debris, mud, and stones from the river water would get stuck inside, and then people had to resort to the tried and true leather buckets again. Modern fire hydrants deliver thousands of liters of water per minute. A firefighter simply opens the valve and gets an endless stream. In the Middle Ages, every liter was earned through blood and sweat. This scarcity of resources taught people to value every drop of liquid. You wouldn't waste water if you'd carried it half a kilometer yourself. The experience of constant fires forced urban planners to change their approach to water. New cities began to be planned around a system of canals and large reservoirs. People realized that access to water was more important than the convenience of trade routes. This lesson cost Europe millions of burned-down houses and shattered lives. And until there were water pipes, all hope rested on a simple bucket. Let's talk about the most underrated object of the Middle Ages. An ordinary fire bucket looks boring to the modern, spoiled eye, but in reality, it was a masterpiece of engineering for its time. Coopers and leatherworkers created a tool perfectly suited for extreme conditions, and the shape of these buckets was radically different from what we use today. First, they never had a flat bottom. They had a convex or cone-shaped base, like a torpedo. Why complicate the design of a simple water container like that, so that no one could set it on the ground and use it for everyday purposes? A bucket with a round bottom immediately tips over, spilling all the liquid onto the floor. This ingenious solution protected firefighting equipment from theft. A peasant couldn't take such a bucket to milk a cow. The tool always remained in its place, waiting for the alarm. Modern designers call this foolproofing. Medieval craftsmen applied this principle long before the advent of such clever terms. They were made from very thick and stiff cowhide. Wooden buckets were too heavy and broke easily when dropped. Metal ones cost a fortune and heated up quickly from the fire. Leather was light, durable, and didn't burn rescuers' hands. The seams were impregnated with resin, so the vessel wouldn't leak during transfer. Every item was stamped with the guild's mark or the owner's coat of arms. After a fire, empty buckets would pile up in a massive heap on the street. They had to be sorted out and returned to their rightful owners without any fights. The markings helped quickly restore order to this chaos. It was the precursor to inventory numbers on modern equipment. The production of such buckets became an incredibly profitable business. Cities purchased them by the thousands to supply every district. Leatherworkers received massive government contracts and grew rich before everyone's eyes. While some faced war and fire, others saw a golden opportunity to earn gold coins. The economy of disasters has always operated by its own cynical laws. Interestingly, the repair of this equipment was also strictly controlled. A damaged bucket was considered a crime against the city's public safety. Special inspectors went around the courtyards and checked the condition of the leather. If the vessel leaked, the owner faced trial and public censure. Safety was maintained through fear of punishment, not through high civic consciousness. I once tried to lift a full-scale replica of such a bucket. My arms felt a weight that seemed much greater than 10 kilograms. The balance, due to the conical bottom, constantly shifts, requiring muscle tension. Now imagine doing this while exhausted after a march. These people had nerves of steel and incredible endurance. An ordinary leather bucket saved more European cities than kings. It was a symbol of that era, rough, smelly, but reliable. We've grown accustomed to complex technology that breaks down from dust. This medieval tool worked flawlessly under the most hellish conditions, but even the best equipment couldn't save them from human stupidity. If you think modern laws are strict, take a look at the Middle Ages. The punishments for arson or even carelessness were absolutely merciless. The authorities understood only one language, the language of total terror. A person whose negligence caused a city to burn rarely lived to see the trial. An enraged mob of neighbors meted out justice right on the smoldering ruins. Arsonists faced the most terrible fate of all. They were usually sentenced to be burned at the stake in the town square. This was a symbolic punishment meant to highlight the irony of justice. Fire for fire. That was the main rule of medieval criminal justice. And after such spectacles, the number of people willing to play with matches dropped sharply. But what if a fire started accidentally due to a simple mistake? The law didn't make much distinction between malicious intent and mere negligence. If your fallen candle burned down your neighbor's house, you paid a fine, and the amount of that fine was such that a person became destitute. They had to sell themselves into slavery to cover the damage caused. That is why many of the culprits preferred to flee the city before dawn. They abandoned what remained of their possessions and hid in the dense forests. Becoming an outcast was better than hanging from a noose in the town square. The city archives are full of records of people who disappeared after major fires. The fear of the community's vengeance was stronger than any attachment to one's hometown. Special inspection teams were created to monitor stoves. Officials went from house to house, checking the construction of chimneys and fireplaces. If a stove seemed dangerous to them, they could smash it with a sledgehammer on the spot. No one asked for a search warrant or court permission. The safety of the majority always outweighed the rights of any one individual. Craftsmen who used open fires were subject to particularly strict controls. Blacksmiths were forced to move their workshops to bodies of water on the outskirts. Bakers were forbidden to work at night while everyone else slept peacefully. This ruined their businesses, but the authorities were adamant in their decision. Lawsuits and complaints from the guilds were simply ignored by the city magistrates. Interestingly, some places even introduced a tax on smoking. When tobacco first appeared in Europe, it caused numerous fires. People would fall asleep with pipes in their mouths on straw mattresses. The authorities quickly realized the connection and imposed huge duties on smokers. Modern cigarette taxes have the same historical roots. Sometimes the paranoia reached the point of utter legislative absurdity. In some German cities, it was forbidden to keep firewood that was too dry at home. People were forced to lightly dampen the wood so it wouldn't catch fire instantly. This caused stoves to smoke incredibly heavily, and people choked on the fumes. But the logic was simple. Smoke kills more slowly than a bright flame. All these draconian measures eventually yielded positive results. The number of accidental household fires began to decline gradually but steadily. The fear of losing all their possessions and their lives forced people to be more careful. We complain about fire inspections in our offices. Be thankful that the inspector can't burn you at the stake. This is how a safety culture based on pain and fines took shape. Society slowly learned to manage its most destructive force. But there was one problem that lawmakers couldn't solve for a long time. This problem lurked inside homes, gathering black and sticky death. I'm talking about chimneys and the people who were required to clean them. The invention of the chimney was a huge step forward for comfort. No longer did people have to breathe the acrid smoke that filled the room. But this innovation brought with it an invisible and insidious threat. Combustible soot began to accumulate on the inner walls of the narrow pipes. This substance is called creosote, and it burns like napalm. A chimney fire is one of the most terrifying sights. The pipe begins to roar like a jet engine during takeoff. A column of flame bursts from the top, showering the entire roof with sparks. It is practically impossible to extinguish such a fire from the outside due to the chimney's design. The house burns from the inside while you try to douse the roof with water. That is precisely why a profession emerged that became a symbol of urban folklore. Chimney sweeps were the people who did the dirtiest job in the world. They had to scrape creosote off the walls, preventing terrible disasters. Without their regular work, any stone house would eventually turn into a time bomb. Their profession was the guarantee that the city wouldn't blow up. But the reality of this work was far from cheerful fairy tales. Often the chimneys were so narrow that an adult would get stuck inside. That's why the masters hired young orphan boys for this hellish task. The children crawled through narrow, dark shafts, choking on poisonous dust. This is a dark chapter in history that is rarely taught in school. Chimney sweeps used stiff brushes and metal scrapers. They lowered them on ropes if the chimney was straight. But medieval architects loved to build curved chimneys with complex shapes. It was believed that this better retained heat inside a large building. That is why it was simply impossible to do without a living person inside. Interestingly, chimney sweeps were often considered a symbol of good luck. People believed that touching a soot-covered person brought good luck. In reality, the good luck lay in a different, more practical matter. If a chimney sweep left your house, it meant you wouldn't burn down that day. It makes perfect sense to view the savior of your property as a harbinger of good news. Authorities required city residents to have their chimneys swept at least twice a year. If a fire broke out, inspectors would first check the condition of the chimney. If it was clogged with soot, the homeowner would pay a fine for negligence. Receipts from chimney sweeps had to be kept as key evidence of innocence. This is very similar to modern vehicle inspection certificates. The profession evolved, and over time, more humane methods emerged. Telescopic poles and heavy weights were invented to break through blockages. The use of children in Europe was not banned until the 19th century. Until then, thousands of lives had been sacrificed for safety. Fire claimed its victims even when it wasn't burning. Experience with chimneys taught people the importance of prevention. They realized that preventing a disaster was easier than swinging hooks around at night. This principle became the foundation of the entire modern fire safety system. But to fully solve the problem, the cities themselves had to change. Wood had to give way to a material that wasn't afraid of sparks. The Great Fires of London became a catalyst for global architectural change. When the city burned to the ground, King Charles issued a historic decree: no more wooden frames or thatched roofs in the center of the capital. The new London was to be rebuilt in brick, stone, and lead. It was an incredibly expensive but vitally necessary step for survival. The transition to stone was slow and met with enormous resistance. People complained about the high cost of materials and the shortage of skilled masons. Bricks had to be fired, which in itself required fire, but the government understood. Better to go broke once than to burn down every decade. Subsidies and tax breaks helped citizens rebuild their homes. Along with the materials, the very structure of the city streets changed. Narrow, winding alleys began to be replaced by wide, straight avenues. This was done not for aesthetic reasons, but to stop the spread of flames. A wide street served as a natural fire break for an entire neighborhood. Fire simply could not jump across a 30-meter wide stone pavement. Architects began designing buildings with solid side walls. These walls had no windows, so flames could not penetrate inside. Firewalls became a mandatory element of any new urban development. If one house burned, the neighboring one remained completely unscathed. This ingenious invention saved thousands of lives in the centuries that followed. Interestingly, stone houses even changed the indoor climate. Stone heats up more slowly and retains heat longer in winter. People began using less firewood to heat their rooms. Less firewood meant fewer open fires and a lower risk of fire. It was a perfect chain reaction leading to universal safety. But old habits died hard and with great difficulty. Peasants in the suburbs continued to build cheap wooden shacks. City authorities had to forcibly demolish illegal, flammable structures. There were actual riots against stone architecture and the new rules. Progress always forces its way through the discontent of ordinary people. With the development of stone construction, the first insurance companies appeared. They assessed risks and issued policies to owners of sturdy homes. Insurers even created their own professional firefighting teams. These teams extinguished fires only in homes displaying the company's sign. Capitalism took the fight against fire into its own grasping hands. If a burning house lacked the required sign, firefighters simply stood by. They could turn around and leave, letting the building burn to the ground. It sounds wild, but that's exactly how the first commercial rescue services operated. Safety had finally become a commodity that had to be purchased. the poor still relied solely on leather buckets and their neighbors. Modern megacities of glass and concrete owe their appearance to those fires. The building codes we now consider tedious bureaucracy were written in ashes. Every clause in the fire safety regulations represents someone's life lost to the flames. A wooden city was a romantic but utterly unviable concept. Fire forced humanity to grow up and become wiser in architecture. Stone defeated wood, and reason defeated blind panic. Gradually, the need to tear down houses with iron hooks disappeared. Night watchmen became a thing of the past, giving way to professionals. But the spirit of those first rescuers has remained in history forever, and their experience gave us systems without which the modern world would collapse. Looking back, medieval methods seem brutal and primitive. Beating neighbors for spilled water and breaking down houses with hooks is strange. But it was precisely in this chaos that the main principles of modern rescue were born. Isolate the source, create a buffer zone, ensure an uninterrupted water supply. Today, we do the same thing, simply using helicopters and fire hydrants. The concept of collective responsibility became the foundation of civil society. People realized that it is impossible to survive alone in the city. Your safety ends where your neighbor's foolishness begins. This forced people to unite into voluntary militias and guilds. Social bonds strengthened more quickly under the threat of a common fiery enemy. We have also inherited the idea of strict building codes. When a developer argues with an inspector over the width of a hallway, that's history. The width of a hallway is calculated so that a crowd can rush outside. Medieval streets were narrow, and people often died in stampedes. Our rules are written so that we do not repeat their mistakes. The leather bucket has evolved into sophisticated pump stations and fire hoses, but the principle of rapid response has remained absolutely unchanged since then. In firefighting, every precious second counts. The firefighter on duty, sleeping in his uniform by the truck, is a direct descendant of the night watchman. Both wait for the sound that will make them spring into action. Modern scientists study the dynamics of fire using computers. They create models of how flames move through buildings. Medieval people learnt this through practical experience, losing their homes in the process. Their empirical knowledge cost them all the property they had acquired through backbreaking labor. We benefit from the fruits of their painful experience every single day. It's funny that we're returning to wood in modern architecture. New technologies make it possible to make wood resistant to direct flames. A medieval peasant would have viewed a wooden skyscraper as madness. He would have concluded that we had simply gone mad from a life of plenty. Perhaps, in some ways, this weary man from the past would have been right. The fear of fire remains deep within our genes. We still freeze when we hear a siren wailing in the street. This primal instinct warns us of the greatest danger. Fire was humanity's first tool, but also its first executioner, and this dual nature is what makes it so mesmerizing and terrifying. I want you to remember this as you walk past a fire extinguisher. That red canister on the wall is the result of hundreds of years of evolution. It contains a power our ancestors could only dream of. You hold in your hands magic capable of stopping a monster in seconds. Appreciate it, because in the past, people had to tear down their own homes. The history of firefighting is a story of human perseverance. Cities burned to the ground, but people stubbornly rebuilt them. They didn't surrender to the elements, they learned to control them. It's an incredible example of how a species adapts to challenging conditions, and it is precisely this trait that has made us the dominant species on the planet. We continue to battle fires in forests and megacities, but now we are armed with knowledge passed down to us through the centuries. Every rule and every tool has its own long, bloody history. To know it is to respect the labor of those who fought without water. They laid the foundation for the safe world in which we live. This was the reality in which our ancestors lived. No romantic tales of knights and beautiful ladies in castles. Only a constant, exhausting struggle for survival every dark night. The Middle Ages were dirty, harsh, and smelled of burnt wood. But out of this harshness, truly ingenious solutions and systems were born. The next time you complain about noisy neighbors, think about it. In the 14th century, you would have prayed that your neighbor wouldn't fall asleep. You would have been grateful for his light sleep and quick reaction to smoke. Our comfort often blinds us to basic survival issues. We've delegated our safety to professionals and forgotten how to take care of ourselves. I hope this story has changed your view of the past. Medieval people weren't fools running in panic through the streets. They were tough, pragmatic, and incredibly organized in times of crisis. Their methods are frightening, but they worked under conditions of absolute scarcity. And therein lies the true beauty of historical engineering. We've explored why wooden towns burned like dry gunpowder. We've seen how night watchmen battled paranoia and darkness. You learned why demolishing your neighbor's house was the best plan for survival. And now you understand the hidden genius of a simple leather bucket. All these pieces come together to form an amazing picture of human resilience. If you enjoyed this in-depth historical analysis, let me know. History hides many more incredible systems and forgotten technologies. We're used to studying the wars of kings, forgetting about the everyday struggles of ordinary people. Yet it was precisely there that the most interesting and dramatic events took place. The survival of the common person always requires maximum ingenuity and cunning. Write in the comments which facts surprised you the most. Was it the night watch, the destruction of houses, or the leather buckets? Perhaps you wouldn't have survived a single day in medieval London, or maybe you would have made an excellent commander of a rescue chain. Share your thoughts, because history only comes alive through discussion. Don't forget to check the batteries in your home smoke detectors. Our ancestors would have given all the gold in the world for such a small plastic box. Protect yourself and your home from careless use of fire. Nature does not forgive mistakes, whether in the 13th or the 21st century. Be smarter than the guy with the dropped candle in the straw house. Many more amazing discoveries from the past await us. We will continue to explore how people solved unsolvable problems. Subscribe so you don't miss new journeys deep into the centuries and millennia. This is a channel where history ceases to be a boring list of dates from a textbook. Here, the past comes alive and reveals its darkest, most authentic aspects. Thank you for watching this long and detailed story all the way through. Your attention to detail makes creating such stories truly worthwhile. Remember that knowledge of the past helps us build a safer future. This has been the voice of history, echoing through the centuries and the ashes. Until we meet again, and may your nights always be peaceful.